And what was really, really interesting to me, which I had never anticipated, was every night as I went to sleep, scenes would play over from my life in my mind's eye, starting at about age 5 or 6. And I'd start to understand why people had done things. I said, oh, that's why this happened. And the only way I can describe it is it felt like my psyche got integrated into a whole, which had never been before. And interestingly, over the years, I've worked with psychiatrists in Toronto who send clients to me, and they find if somebody has a difficulty in this area, they can't benefit from insight therapy. And at a certain point through the exercise, the individual can benefit from insight, because insight, you have to make connections, you have to see cause and effect. If that isn't working, then the person struggles with benefiting from that kind of therapy. So that was one area that I addressed. And when I saw those results, I thought, okay, there is human neuroplasticity, because this was back in 1978, 1979, when certainly at that time I was told learning difficulties have nothing to do with the brain, and there's no such thing as neuroplasticity. And I did believe at the time, if there was neuroplasticity in rats, I mean, humans, hopefully, we would have as much neuroplasticity as rats and possibly more. So then I would decide, okay, what about that part of my brain that isn't registering sensation and mapping it onto my body? And could I create an exercise to address that area? And by this time, I was driving a car. And imagine if I didn't know where the left side of my body was, by extension, I didn't know where the left side of that car was. So my car ended up being dented and banged and not in great shape, just like my body was. And you know, I'd had multiple injuries by this time, and thought, you know, this was an important area to address. So I knew to address this area, I had to create an exercise, for me, using my eyes, keeping my eyes closed, and registering very fine sensory movements, sensory feedback, because I didn't want to compensate using my eyes, which is what I did. I watched this side of my body all the time. And so I created an exercise where eventually I could draw incredibly complex shapes with my eyes closed by feeling the sense of movement, and would be as accurate with my eyes closed as with my eyes open. And at the end of that, I could begin to register sensation. So now I can map sensation onto the left side of my body. I can play sports. I'm much more coordinated and significantly less awkward. And I'm really no longer a danger to myself. And I no longer dent and bang up my car, which is good. So I've now addressed with two very different exercises, two different cognitive functions. And then I thought that part of my brain that maps, that represents space, spatial navigation, could I address that? Because anytime I went to a new place, I had to calculate in what I call lost time, because I would get lost multiple times anywhere I went. And you know, that was a bit of a challenge, and I couldn't read maps at all. So I created an exercise there using mazes and all sorts of spatial relations, and at the end of that, the result was I can now translate two-dimensional diagrams into three-dimensional representation. Now, those words, some assembly required, doesn't make me break out into a sweat. I can actually build IKEA, you know, cabinets and bookshelves and go from the map, and I can navigate. I can actually find my way around. I don't have to calculate in lost time. And interestingly, some of these difficulties are hereditary, not necessarily, but this one my mother had, and I had, and one of my 4 brothers had. And with my mother and I, it was very interesting when we would get into a car when I was a child. Like, we knew where we were starting, we knew where we wanted to end up, but it was like a black hole in between because there were no maps in either of our heads. And my mother had a really good attitude. She said it'll be an adventure. Like, we'll get there eventually, which we did, and never the same way twice. But, you know, she didn't seem to let it bother her. But when I got older, and I asked her, had this really impacted her, because I wanted to know. And she shared with me that she had started out at university wanting to be a chemist. And after partway through her first year was sort of gently encouraged not to go into chemistry. She struggled with creating, representing three-dimensional space, creating molecules and building and constructing molecules. And interestingly, my brother that has this difficulty, and these things operate on a continuum. Someone can have an exceptional ability, mild difficulty, moderate, severe. My mother and I were probably on the severe end of the spectrum of this, and my brother probably more at the mild. He did become a chemist at University of Toronto. But he went into physical chemistry. He could construct the molecules, but it took a lot of work and effort on his part. So for me, it seemed, yes, the brain is capable of change. Very, very targeted differential stimulation can lead to improved cognitive functioning in very, very specific areas. So could I take this work and start to work with other people? So I started mainly working with young adults at the time who would come in. They had finished high school but couldn't go on to university or college because of their difficulties. And it kind of became a working laboratory because they didn't all have the same problems that I had. So they'd come in, describe their problems. I'd go back into Laurie's work trying to understand what was that function, what could I use to stimulate or improve it. And over time, some of the things that I created ended up in the garbage pail, but over time got better and better at refining the cognitive programs and went on to identify 19 different cognitive functions, some predominantly more in the left hemisphere, some in the right, related to learning and starting to work with people with those. And I'm very clear that the brain is much more complex than just these 19 functions that I can currently work with, and they tend to be a broad range of difficulties, from navigating in space, face recognition, recognizing objects and landmarks, different aspects of auditory memory, quantity, quantification, numeracy, number sense, the ability to plan, think, problem solve, the ability to read nonverbal cues in social situations, so a range of cognitive functions. And what I've learned is, each individual that comes to me or to the schools that offer the program have different cognitive profiles, and to address their difficulties, you have to understand that unique profile and target it very, very specifically.